Well, fancy meeting you guys out here in the endless vacuum of space. Yeah, I kind of figured since our time in Silent Hill was a little stressful to say the least, maybe it was time that I got about as far away from that town as possible. So I boarded the USG Ishimura looking to get a little R&R out here among the stars. To be honest though, I'm starting to question that decision. I don't know exactly what's going on here, but ever since we entered Aegis 7's orbit, people have been acting a little crazy. Oh well, I'm sure everything's going to be just fine, so why don't you guys join me? I hear the crew's about to initiate the planet cracking process. Sounds like it could be fun and certainly not a mistake whose repercussions will be felt by every human being in existence. Right? What's up guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to the Dead Space Retrospective.
Above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky.
Dead Space rocked the industry in a few ways pretty damn hard, and that's before it was even released. For those of you with the ability to remember events a whole console generation ago, things were actually kind of bleak for us. Most game releases that didn't belong to an established series were laughed out the door, and we were all still balls deep in the cover-based shooting craze that infected its way into every game developer's game design handbook. And then here comes Dead Space, an unknown in an ocean of gaming dynasties, a game that put horror damn near the top of the priorities list. Oh yeah, and I guess the creepy-ass trailer and advertising didn't hurt much either. Developed by what used to be Visceral Games, Dead Space was a pretty big change in their long-established MO. See, these guys have always been known for putting out games that people generally liked, but nothing on their list of accomplishments is exactly what I would call required playing material, with the exception of Future Cop LAPD, of course. Dead Space was the first horror game these guys ever attempted, and on top of that, it's the first game that really gave the studio a chance to flex their creative muscles outside of a movie tie-in, and holy hell, talk about knocking it out of the park your first try. And speaking of wild successes, let's see what we have to deal with in the story department. With very obvious influences from just about every horror and psychological thriller set in space ever, this game already had a lot going for it in my mind. I've always loved the cold, dark, isolating feeling that comes from media set outside of our orbit, and Dead Space lives up to its pedigree right out of the gate. Upon pressing start on the title screen, we take control of Isaac Clarke, an engineer who's been assigned to what seems to be a quasi-military/corporate rescue effort. Your small group has been sent in to check up on the USG Ishimura, a massive planet cracker, which is essentially like an offshore drilling rig but in space. And instead of drilling, they're busting open planets for their resources. So you know, similar idea. It seems like the Ishimura...
The USG Ishimura.
Oh, I'm sorry, my mistake. The USG Ishimura sent a distress signal some time ago, but no one's been able to get in touch since. So our ragtag little team have been sent in, and right from the start, some typical gaming tropes are being challenged. First off, despite the fact that there are trained goons on the ship, we take control of the deep space equivalent of a grease monkey, a futuristic repairman, if you will. I've always enjoyed games that have you taking on the role of a kind of everyman instead of a grizzled mercenary type. But getting back to the intro, a lot of vital information is given out in this short period. We're taught almost everything we need to know about the Ishimura, but on top of that, we find out that Isaac has a personal stake in this mission.
Guess you really miss her. Don't worry, we're almost there. You'll be able to look her up once we're on board. Sounds like you do have a lot of catching up to do.
Once we arrive on site, this intro really flexes its muscles with an awesome orchestral tune and some, for the time, jaw-dropping visuals. But sadly, this is also where things start to go wrong for our group. Upon trying to dock with the mammoth mining ship, things go pretty far south, and the rescue vessel has to crash inside the Ishimura. After that, the team gets jumped by unknown assailants, and Isaac gets separated from the rest of the group. From here, it's a matter of both finding a new way to get off the ship and digging into what exactly happened here. Everywhere you look, the environment makes it clear some dead serious stuff went down, and discovering the events that led up to the current predicament is actually more satisfying than Isaac's personal stake in all this. Which is good because we go long periods of time where Isaac's story gets put on hold in order to tell more of the Ishimura's history. Oh yeah, and there are what seems to be reanimated corpses running around trying to kill everything with a pulse. That's probably important to mention. As you progress, you learn about what seems to be a major religion in this world, unitology, apparently a belief system that's known for what we'll charitably call overexcited zealotry. These unitologists believe an intelligent alien species created man, and a big part of their belief system is the existence of what they call a marker, an alien device of unknown origin that's supposed to prove the existence of these aliens. And wouldn't you know it, there's all kinds of rumors and top secret documents floating around that the Ishimura has come across just such a marker. The rest of the game is this amazingly well-paced trek through the process of piecing together all of these really cool events and getting an idea of what's going on here. We have these unitologists obviously being involved in some way, then there's the fact that everyone's talking about some strange discovery down on the planet, and then there's this mass outbreak of craziness going on. People begin fighting with each other, losing sleep, murmuring gibberish to themselves, and no one seems to be acting rationally. Then you have the appearance of the Necromorphs, which act like a thinking, breathing disease that seeks out dead bodies to repurpose as mangled piles of jagged bone and skin. Now, it's important to mention that there are two parallel plot lines running through this game. First, we have the story of Isaac, his fellow rescue crew, and their plight to not only survive, but escape the planet Cracker. This story is told through a very traditional sense, with characters leading Isaac around by the nose, and we get to experience these events in real time. Now, set that against the vastly more interesting tale of what happened to the Ishimura. This story is told using what I like to call the George Romero school of tell, don't show, and any of you OGs familiar with his early work will know exactly what I mean. In his movies, Romero worried that from a lack of budget or resources, he wouldn't be able to show the viewers all of the details needed to build a believable and large world for his movies to take place in. So instead, he challenged the show don't tell mantra by flipping it on its head. Instead of actively showing the viewer the war zone that was Carson City and Night of the Living Dead, he had Ben describe it to Barbara, and by proxy, us. This way the audience gets to build the world of the media in their own heads, where everything is custom tuned to their specific taste. Dead Space pulls the same exact trick by having Isaac find out about all of this stuff secondhand, which is mostly handled through text and audio logs. Sometimes the point of this log will be something mundane like someone having to do maintenance, but will mention something offhand about a growing unease among the Ishimura's crew, or some security official will give a report regarding some riots or mass violence breaking out. The pieces of the puzzle are there, and if we're being honest, they're kind of hard to miss, so don't worry about this being a Silent Hill situation where only those willing to search every nook and cranny will know the full story. This means you get the satisfaction putting the pieces together yourself, but you don't have to worry about missing out on some giant plot thread because you rushed out of a room without searching it thoroughly. And let me say this right off the bat, as if I haven't made it obvious already, but I absolutely love this approach. Gathering together all of these disparate little pieces of information and turning them into some kind of cohesive plot really hits me in all the right ways. Plus, the beauty of having all of these events exist only as secondhand accounts means the story will always be perfect, since it mostly exists in my head. Had they have visually shown everything that led up to this ship becoming a floating morgue, they may have bungled the execution, ruining what was an awesome idea. Instead, I get to imagine all of these things going on, using the environment as some kind of resource pool for my speculation. In my opinion, this will always be a better approach than just showing the player something, because it custom tunes the story to each person, kind of like how a book will always be just a little bit better and more personal than a movie. And I'd love to get into the main story of the game instead of gushing about one that only exists in my head, but before I do, I have to give a slight spoiler warning. From here on, we'll be discussing some things that will rob you of your chance to experience a lot of these twists and turns yourself, so if by some chance you haven't played this game before, either click the timestamp in the description or skip to the time on screen. Trust me, this story is worth experiencing for yourself.
Isaac, make us whole again.
Alright, so now that the newbies are gone, let's talk specifics. Isaac being a silent protagonist was a really awesome move, but not for the usual reasons. Most of the time, as you all probably know, the silent protag thing is used as a kind of developer shorthand for we want you to insert yourself into this tale, but in this scenario it takes on a very different meaning. And that's mostly because, despite being silent, Isaac is an actual character. He has a goal for being here beyond just surviving, and as the story continues, he only gets stronger motivations. Don't get me wrong, you'll definitely find yourself projecting onto him a lot, but he's definitely what I would call a fully realized character despite that. As the game enters its last act, we get betrayed, find out the unitologists were embedded far deeper than we first thought, and watch other characters die. But through it all, he's more interested in finding Nicole than anything else. And he eventually does. about 15 minutes before it's revealed that she's been dead the whole time. A hunch I'm sure all of us had from day one, but the way it's handled is masterfully done in my opinion, and even though Isaac doesn't speak in this scene, his sagged shoulders and shaking head tells it all. Throughout the entire story, he's had his face obscured by his suit and helmet, and in a stroke of genius, the devs give us one very satisfying face reveal at the very end of the game, followed by a killer jump scare letting us know the marker had a relatively permanent effect on his mind. Without a doubt, this is one of the most pleasing game endings I have ever experienced. All of the dangling plot threads have been cut, but leaving just enough ambiguity. This left me with just the right amount of questions in the end and had me absolutely jonesing for more Dead Space media, a desire that would luckily be fulfilled by a plethora of comics and movies, but we'll cover those another time. But until then, the takeaway should be these guys knew exactly how much of this story they needed to tell and how much they needed to leave up to the player. You really don't get confidence like this in a lot of AAA games, since the running MO for big developers is to over-explain every plot element just in case a single microsecond goes by with the player thinking for themselves. Visceral told us what was needed to build a satisfying story, but left a lot of it up to us to discover, and that kind of approach will always be appreciated by me. This way, a person not so interested in all the background stuff can just kind of skip it, while those of us who have sunk into the narrative can dig deeper and actually find something substantial. Well, that's about all I wanted to gush about, so what do you say we let the others back in? Alright, so hopefully I've made it pretty clear that this is a story I very much enjoyed. Not only do I already have a soft spot for psychological tinged horror taking place out in the stars, but on top of that, Dead Space tells this stuff to you in a masterful way. The main story is told straight to you through dialogue, but the environment tells a very different story. Everywhere you look, you're seeing what was likely someone's last move. There's evidence of people making their last stand, saying goodbye to loved ones, and the mad scrawls of the insane. This all but forced me to seek out more information, and Visceral were more than happy to provide that info. If you ask me, this is probably one of the most rich and complete horror stories ever told in a video game, and I absolutely wouldn't have it any other way. I don't do numerical scores here, but the words 10 out of 10 do come to mind. Even if you think the gameplay might not be to your taste, trust me, this tale is one worth experiencing. Just make sure to keep an extra pair of pants handy. You know, just in case. Dead Space's gameplay is often described as survival horror, in the same way the core of the Earth could be described as being cool to the touch. That is to say, fucking inaccurately. And look, I get it, you guys are probably tired of hearing me say that about games, but can we all just agree that having an emphasis on horror is not all that it takes to make a survival horror title? I mean, all games have music, but no one's about to call Def Jam Fight for New York a music game. I mean, even if my definition of the genre is rather rigidly based on the game that coined the term, I think we can all find some common ground if we agree that games who reward combat with resources just don't fit the bill. If not, well, maybe you should start a relatively unsuccessful YouTube channel and I can come to your comment section and yell at you. Tangent aside, Dead Space is an action horror game, only with the horror taking more of a front seat position, which at the time was not the AAA gaming status quo. The perspective is going to be familiar to anyone who's ever played RE4, but instead of lazily copying Capcom's Homer, Visceral put their own unique spin on it, which results in a really refreshing experience. But before we talk about how much it deviates from the formula, let's talk about how much it doesn't. Much like the aforementioned RE4, Dead Space features a large, sprawling environment but locks you into smaller areas one at a time. And the general flow goes a little something like this. Your compatriots on the ship will yell at you to accomplish some kind of task, most of the time things that they just flat out refuse to do themselves, and then you'll be guided to a tram system, and once you're inside the new area, you'll have goals drip-fed to you. Like coming across this barricade and then dropping the original objective for a new one, like finding all the pieces needed to make a homemade bomb. A formula that does a great job of keeping you from thinking about the monotony that it's actually putting you through. On repeat playthroughs, you may notice a pattern of your partners asking you to find some kind of part needed to fix something, and then upon finding that MacGuffin, the thing you were trying to fix gets destroyed, but it's the masterful use of tension and immediacy that kept me from really noticing this. You're almost never timed in these little missions, but even so I found myself keeping up a quick pace, mostly because it does such a good job at conveying the sense of emergency. That being said, there are going to be plenty of moments where you come across an area packed with an eerie atmosphere and environmental storytelling which will have you slowing down and really taking everything in. The design of the Ishimura is not only a believable layout for such an old utilitarian ship filled with futuristic construction workers, but this design also feeds into a really intuitive gameplay experience. Even when the environment was at its most complicated, the right direction was always only a hallway and a door away. I saw some people criticize the game at launch as a corridor shooter, and while 75% of Dead Space is spent in long metallic hallways, I think any gameplay style can be effective as long as the game's design is well tooled around that approach. And the formula of zigzagging through creepy corridors, getting jumped by lanky-armed zombie aliens, and then having that fight spill into a wide open section where the objective is located never got on my nerves. And now that we're further in, I have to bring this up again. The real reason why it bothers me so much when people call this a survival horror title is how linear it is. You're always locked into a very small single area of the ship, and the path to your objective will always be a straight line. Sure, there's going to be some locked doors you come across along the way, but you'll learn early on that these doors are more often than not unlocked by one of your compatriots as your current objective gets completed. Hell, sometimes there's no reason for a door to unlock at all, it just will on its own after you've done what you've needed to in that area. And hear me out, I'm not using the word linear as a criticism. Not every game is going to have you backtracking across a big map and unlocking more traversal options as you go. Some games make linearity work, and Dead Space is one of the best examples of that. So I'm definitely a fan of what's being done here, but you just can't call it survival horror. And I know I'm harping on about this issue a lot, but I think it's kind of important. Survival horror is a genre with very clear and delineated traits, but it seems like in the last decade or so, it's turned into vague lip service that's used as a kind of verbal shorthand for a horror game of some description. And honestly, it's not really the fans of these games that are to blame here. Yahtzee is a huge name in games media and an awesome content creator who genuinely seems to have a lot of technical knowledge regarding the medium, but here he is making a verifiably false statement as if it were indisputable fact.
Dead Space is a sci-fi survival horror featuring an engineer named Isaac Clarke.
Hell, even one of my favorite content creators, Grimbeard, is just as guilty.
Condemned Criminal Origins is a first-person survival horror game.
Listen, the point of all this is to say survival horror is indeed a genre, and that means there are requirements for calling a game survival horror. And sadly, not a lot of games fit that description, but I've become more and more frustrated watching it lose its identity as it gets rolled under the general horror banner. If you ask me, the title of survival horror has just kind of come to be used as a qualifier for this is a really good, high-quality horror game. I think the term horror sort of carries this cheap, schlocky reputation with it, and some people try to counter that with the addition of survival to kind of imply that the game is good or effective, just not in so many words. And yeah, in the grand scheme of things, this isn't exactly a huge issue. It's just strange to see so many people misusing a label like this. Hopefully I've shed a little bit of light on the problem, or at the very least given a little more of an explanation into why I feel this way, but regardless, I promise this will be the last time that gets brought up. In this video. Probably. So getting back to what we were discussing, what seems like 12 or 13 paragraphs ago, the game's story and characters do a great job of talking you into doing these things, and the combat is so damn enjoyable that you really don't care where you're going or why. You just hope you'll be able to kill a few hundred Necromorphs on the way. Plus, the design of the Ishimura itself has this contradictory effect, where everything is about as spooky and uninviting as you could possibly imagine, and yet you can't help but want to progress through it so you can see more. Speaking of seeing more, you'll be seeing a lot of items on your little trip. Almost everywhere you look in Dead Space, there's something to pick up, whether it's stuff hidden kind of out of the way, chests filled with loot, or items dropped from enemies. You'll be picking up a lot of stuff. In fact, I've seen a lot of people use the limited resources argument in favor of classifying this as a survival horror title, but I don't know what game they were playing because I never at any point in Dead Space ran out of ammo or healing items. In fact, more often than not, it's the opposite. I'll be so jam-packed with items that I have to drop a few just to make room for a little more. And if you find yourself in that same position, there are shops scattered everywhere where you can buy and sell items, including fresh fits for your boy. Aside from the starting plasma cutter, all other weapons in the game are going to be found here. Well, kind of. You'll find blueprints for other weapons in a few different spots, and bringing these back to the shop means you can now purchase them. But to be honest, I never really needed any of them. I always go for the line gun, aka this game's shotgun, first, and then maybe the pulse rifle next, but I always just end up using the plasma cutter in the end. Having other weapons means more ammo competing for space in the inventory, and on top of that, every enemy in the game is easily killable with this starting pistol equivalent. especially when you take into account your ability to use power nodes to improve your gear, and buying more weapons means spreading your supply of these things even thinner. And on that note, I really love the fact that there are real noticeable changes in upgrading your equipment. Unlike most games where these kinds of changes come in these single-digit percentages, each new upgrade here makes the game far more satisfying, especially in the combat. And, well, I guess it's about time we tackle that point, huh? Combat in Dead Space is probably its largest claim to fame. The idea is to do RE4 style over-the-shoulder shooting, but with a twist. Fighting against all of your inbuilt gaming urges, Dead Space has you targeting the limbs of your enemies with the goal of cutting them off. It sounds like such a small change, but it really does spice things up in a very noticeable way. The in-game explanation for this makes a lot of sense, since these things are just reanimated corpses, and the old reliable destroy the brain trope just kind of doesn't apply here. On top of taking enemies out faster, aiming for limbs can also give you a leg up in a fight. Pun intended. Going for an enemy's legs can put them on the ground, somewhat limiting their ability to get to you, and with some enemies, going for their arms can really decrease the options they have to damage you. Since the game is asking for a little more accuracy from the player than your average shooter, there's been some tweaks to UI elements like the on-screen aiming reticle. Using this straight line laser kind of look really lets Dead Space shine visually speaking, but on top of that it makes aiming far easier, at least it does for me, and to be honest I'm not really sure why. I think the common red dot in the middle of the screen always does its job, but for some reason, seeing my projectile's path before I fire it just helps me line up shots far better than I would have otherwise. Or at least it kind of feels that way. If I did have one complaint about this system though, it would be that I often found myself reverting to my old gaming habits in a tight situation and going for headshots. But the game does a good job of punishing you for this, so you're not likely to do it a lot. A Necromorph with a missing head can be really dangerous in a lot of ways. Not only does it attack wildly at anything anywhere near it, but its attack patterns also become random and unpredictable. And I think this is a really great way of both punishing bad play while also rewarding skilled play. A lot of these little systems are in effect during combat, and they really do add up to a more satisfying and, pardon the pun, visceral feeling to the game's mechanics. With Necromorphs that don't have obvious limbs to shoot at, you'll see these glowing yellow weak points show up a lot, and while it does have a very video gamey kind of look to it, it's a visual standard that gets repeated throughout the game. The consistency of this little trick does kind of fall in line with the established look so far, so it comes across as more natural feeling the more you see it. Honestly, Dead Space is a sort of case study on totally nailing combat in a horror game. While the monsters you face do serve as lethal threats with the ability to do massive amounts of damage, their effectiveness is directly controlled by how well you're able to shoot and how quick your reaction time is. A single Necromorph can really mess your shit up if you let it get too close, but you're often given ample opportunities to stop this from happening. As the game goes on and you get better and more acclimated to its combat, you'll notice Necromorphs showing up in higher numbers and closer distances. At the start of the game, you're often given these long, straight arenas that have baddies funneling in from one direction, but towards the halfway point, the game starts having them circle around you and hit you where you're not looking. And to be clear, this isn't their AI getting more challenging, but instead just smart use of the environment's design and enemy placement. The game does keep you on your toes, with enemies entering areas from several points and even retreating back to these vents and coming at you from a different one, but once you've leveled up your weapon enough, really nothing stands a chance. I did find this to be less of an issue in the console ports of Dead Space, as I've always been terrible at shooting accurately with analog sticks, but even then I found things got far easier after about 2 hours of getting used to using a controller again. Normally I'd use a lack of difficulty as an example of how to ruin the horror elements in a game, but Dead Space's level design and atmosphere make sure I stayed pretty creeped out the whole time. And besides, the Necromorphs may get easier as you get better at the game, but they're still very creepy looking visually. Plus their erratic movements, scary ass sound design, and aggressive attacks still put you on edge when they're around. This might honestly be the one game where giving you more options to effectively deal with enemies just does not negatively impact its horror, and I think that's because Dead Space never stops scaring you in other ways. Even towards the end, you'll still get caught jumping at shadows, and the design of the environments combined with the game's absolutely phenomenal lighting and godlike sound design makes this one of the most effective horror games ever made. Outside of all the horror stuff though, I really like this game's puzzles, which all fit in the more environmental variety. Instead of reading logs to get clues to some kind of riddle or combination lock, you'll be searching around your environment for objects to manipulate, like batteries to put into machines and platforms to move around. These may be far easier on the old noggin than your typical survival horror puzzles, but they're also a lot more intuitive. You can walk into a room and pretty much figure out exactly how to progress immediately. mostly because these tasks draw on a lot more real-world experience than the ability to figure out a sliding block puzzle or what item gets used where. So if it weren't totally obvious, I find Dead Space to be supremely enjoyable and nearly flawless as far as gameplay is concerned, but you'll notice I said nearly flawless. There are a few minor issues worth mentioning, and number one on the list with a giant underline has to be this game's PC port. During the Xbox 360 era, we had this really odd little portion of time where PC ports were more popular and common than ever, but for some reason they always ended up having serious flaws compared to their console counterparts. Dead Space in particular has an issue where the aiming speed is tied to the in-game frame rate, making the game damn near unplayable. For the longest time, the only real fix was to just use a USB controller on PC, but nowadays there's a PC mouse fix, which is a required download if you're looking to play it on that platform. And don't worry, I will have it linked in the description. After applying this mouse fix, go ahead and disable the in-game VSync option and instead force VSyncing through an external program like AMD or Nvidia's control panel app. I've heard horror stories about how higher frame rates tend to break the game's physics, but to be honest, I played through Dead Space at 100 Hz and never ran into any issues. So maybe this has been patched out since the last time I played, who knows. On console, the nasty little problem of an unreliable in-game frame rate can be an issue in situations with a lot of smoke, dust, or fog on screen. These console versions target 30 FPS, which is already going to be less than ideal for a game that's asking you to react to situations very quickly, but when the frame rate begins to chug, aiming and shooting can be affected. I didn't play more than a few hours into each console version, and this did make combat a little more challenging, but I wouldn't say it breaks the game or anything. More like it's just, I don't know, a little annoying, but had I have not gone from 100 FPS on PC to 30 on console, this may not have been so jarring of a change. In a more general sense, I really liked how the game had me changing my tactics by forcing me to target enemy limbs, but the devs didn't have much confidence in me picking up on this little strategy. In the very first area of the game, there's a message in blood telling me to go for the limbs and 2 separate interactions with NPCs repeating that.
Listen, forget about shooting them in the body. You gotta cut off the limbs. Grab a cutter, anything like that. Cut them apart.
Honestly, I feel like just the writing on the wall would suffice, and maybe a refresher at the end of the first area for those who hadn't caught on yet, but I have to assume your average person with a 360 or PS3 at the time would be skilled enough at video games to intuit this little strategy just from engaging in combat a few times. I really liked that these creepy-ass stingray-looking things could reanimate the corpses lying around the Ishimura, as it meant that these dead bodies served a purpose beyond mere set dressing. But you can actually interrupt this process by stomping the arms and legs off of these corpses ahead of time. Now don't get me wrong, I really like the added depth this brings, but walking into a room and doing the Isaac Clarke tango on everybody can be tedious, and it sort of feels like you're cheating a bit. After maybe an hour or two, the game's mission structure of people yelling at you to complete tasks they could easily complete themselves will wear on you to a degree, but like I said earlier, the story and characters sort of give you a good incentive to want to do these things. And, well, that's about it. Overall, I found Dead Space to be wildly fun to play through again. The horror atmosphere is so damn well done, and the combat is about as close to perfect as you can get. Even as the long playtime stretched out, the devs did a great job of constantly drip-feeding me more enemy types or unique gameplay scenarios like Zero G, the vacuum of space, or the often hated turret section. There's no doubt in my mind that Dead Space more than lives up to its own hype, and that is a very rare thing in this industry. It took a lot of chances by implementing gameplay that plays against your instincts and combines horror and action in such a way that neither side of the equation should be as strong as it is, but it all just works somehow. Hell, even things I normally don't like in other games just don't bother me that much here. To be honest, there's probably not much of a chance that you guys watching this haven't tried Dead Space out for yourselves yet, but if by chance you happen to fall into that category, please do yourself a favor and remedy that immediately. No matter which platform you choose, you're not likely to spend more than $20 on a copy of Dead Space, and I assure you, it'll be the best 20 you've ever spent. And this is where I really get to flex my creative muscles, because Dead Space is probably just as famous for its presentation as it is for its innovative gameplay. The overall look has this really unique style to it, and there are several important factors that all add up to an insanely effective and aesthetically pleasing look. And the first really big factor for me was the integrated nature of all of the UI elements. In any other game, it's more common than not that you'll see some kind of heads-up display layered over top your gameplay. Something like a health readout or ammo counter, maybe an EXP bar or something of that nature. But Dead Space integrates all of these elements into its own game world, and really successfully. Remaining ammo is shown as an actual readout on your actual weapon. Your health is represented by a little meter on your back, and even things like communications and the inventory have been worked into this laser projection kind of idea. And at first, this doesn't seem like too major of a step to take. After all, the same information is available in all the same ways, but having UI elements worked into the game world like this just adds that one extra factor of immersion, which is really important. When you explain such a video gamey concept like a health bar or maybe an ammo counter as being a real and tangible part of your character's in-game world, you remove a lot of the barriers between the player and that world. In any other game, pulling up the inventory screen transports you to this other place with graphical elements that aren't really consistent with the rest of the game world. Like, let's say in a Resident Evil game, the inventory could not be described as fitting in with the rest of the environment around it, so pulling it up can be a reminder that, oh yeah, I'm playing a video game. Dead Space manages to work these things into its world, and if you ask me, it's probably the most successful application of that idea in modern video games. And since we're on the subject, Dead Space may have one of the most artistically consistent looks I've ever seen. I'm not quite sure how to describe the visual language of the game, but from the characters to Necromorphs to the environment around them, everything feels like it's all part of the same world. The angular lines and almost low-tech look of Isaac's suit looks like it perfectly belongs in this rusted metal tomb around him. I also really liked how they used these bright accent lights to differentiate Isaac's suit, weapons, and other pieces of tech. It creates this really pleasing contrast between the muted metallic backgrounds of the Ishimura and everything else. This makes sure these things stand out visually, but it also helps tie everything together too. The Ishimura may seem a little more run down and in more disarray than what the Necromorphs likely would have caused in such a short amount of time, but that's actually explained from the start of the game when the info being given over the docking bay speakers describes the ship as being the oldest planet cracker in service, which goes back to how much effort was spent during development making sure all of Dead Space's gamey elements were explained as things that actually exist in the game's world. On top of that, Dead Space has this near maniacal obsession with graphical tricks that use the environment in its favor. What I mean by this is post-processing effects like fog, dust particles, falling sparks, insanely good-looking lighting, and even better-looking shadows. Interestingly enough, these small effects do a lot to mask the relatively simplistic and low-res nature of its textures and 3D models. For example, when I get close enough to get a good look at Nicole, it's obvious that she's in a game that's more than a decade old. You could see it written all over her face. Almost literally. But just standing in this area here, and you could be forgiven for thinking this was a game that was released this year. Something as trivial as walking through a hallway you've already been down can be creepy and tense just based on a change in the lighting, like a fixture flickering or some fog rolling in from a cracked door. As another example, this Necromorph looks relatively okay, but it's clear he's not all that detailed or complex. But put him at the other end of a hallway with really effective shadows and some strobing fluorescent lights, and you've got yourself one amazingly scary enemy. Going back and getting more shots for this video, I was genuinely blown away at how well these little lighting and post-processing tricks did to hide the relatively low-spec nature of the visuals here. If you ever needed proof that a good solid lighting system can do wonders for a video game, well, here's your entire argument. Colored lighting also plays a very big role in this killer atmosphere. I noticed that the game would switch between warm and cool color palettes throughout the experience, and each one does a lot to further enforce a room's unique feel. In areas where there's a lot of rust or even dead bodies, there's always a warm orange and yellow tint applied to the lighting, but in areas with more of a sterile and metallic look, you'll see a cooler palette of blues and grays. This can really shift the mood of the area you're in and is another example of one of those small effects that add up to more than the sum of its parts. Oddly enough, Isaac's helmet also plays a pretty big role in the game's visual style, or at the very least as a byproduct of it. And what I mean by that is, the suit you start out with sort of reflects Isaac's involvement in the situation. The rounded look of the facial area looks like a wide-eyed sort of innocence to me, but from the first suit upgrade and on, you start to see more aggressive straight lines and sharp angles, which gives me the feeling of a sort of maturity, kind of like he's now aware of what's going on and has become battle-hardened to a degree. The look of the various Necromorphs you come across manages to be really unique as well, while still using very similar design language. They have these erratic movements which can be really off-putting, and each one is very visually distinct from far away, so you always know which undead threat to prioritize in a fight. Just like I mentioned before, getting up close reveals a relatively simple amount of detail and geometry, but to be fair, you will almost never be face to face with one of these things, and if you are, it's likely going to be in the heat of a fight. So even this game's flaws can be almost impossible to see when everything is in motion and working as intended. You might have noticed that I've been showing you mostly footage of the game's PC ports so far, but you guys know I love comparing ports, so why don't we jump into the other ways you can play Dead Space. Starting out with the Xbox 360 version, I found the visuals to still be fairly impressive despite the obvious downsides of going from the infinitely scalable nature of a PC game to the limited nature of a 360 one. The overall sharpness of the picture definitely suffers here, but that is sort of to be expected. Most games on the 360 and PS3 actually display at 720p or under, but are upscaled internally to match your console's video output settings. So you'll get an image that may fit a 1080p screen, but has all the visual fidelity of something far lower res. And Dead Space ain't exactly bucking that trend, so it doesn't look as good as it theoretically should. On top of that, I'm using a Gen 1 360, which means I'm limited to component video output, and I don't really trust the analog to digital conversion one of my capture cards would be doing, so I ran it through the FrameMeister so I could get a digital image. Now, I obviously lost a little bit of detail, sharpness, and maybe some color information when doing something like this, but it's not the worst way in the world to get some 360 footage. One thing that could definitely be called a universal downside with these versions of the game is the frame rate. Both console versions target 30 frames per second, but each struggles to hit that threshold when the hardware starts getting taxed. I noticed fog and smoke to be the main culprits in slowdown, but having more than a few Necromorphs on screen didn't help either. These moments of slowdown aren't what I would call game-breaking or anything, but you're definitely going to notice them, especially when you move into a relatively simple scene and start seeing the game actually hitting its 30 FPS target. As far as gameplay goes, there's nearly no difference here at all. Picking up the game on a controller after using a keyboard and mouse felt natural as hell, which is probably a testament to how well tuned this game's controls are in general. I will admit though, I've never been very good at shooting accurately with analog sticks. I'm not sure why, but when it comes to shooters both first and third person, I just can't use anything other than a mouse. That being said, as I spent more time with these console ports, I found myself getting more and more acclimated, but if you're already used to this style of input, disregard this little nitpick. The good thing about Dead Space's PC port having nearly no extra bells and whistles is that the 360 version will offer 99.9% of what you would have gotten on PC, so you should be able to jump from one to the other with no issues whatsoever. Moving on to the PS3 version, I noticed what seems like a much clearer and more defined picture, but sadly I can't really know if that's only because I'm converting the 360's analog signal to digital after the fact. Honestly, I'd love to come back to this point one day when I have a 360 with an HDMI port, but for now it looks like the PS3 wins this little contest. So there's definitely a more clear and precise look to the visuals here when I compare them, and it seems like the PS3 version also has a little more sharpness. The difference may be slight, but when you hold them up back to back, it seems like the PS3 does have the edge. And I think I might know why. Remember how I talked before about how these consoles often scaled their video output? Well, it seems like this game doesn't, at least not on the PS3. Dead Space actually outputs a native 720p when you start the game up on a PS3, while the 360 seems to scale the output to 1080p, which might sound like a benefit, but keep in mind, scaling a picture won't produce any more detail or sharpness than was already there, and any little imperfection might be made more noticeable when enlarged. Honestly, I'm not really sure how far this whole thing goes and how many video games are affected by it, but I did set both of my consoles to 1080p when I captured my footage, but only one of them got scaled beforehand, which is really interesting for all the wrong reasons. The 360 version also seems to have a different approach to some effects, as evidenced by this little halo around Isaac's helmet. As you can see, the effect is far more subtle and, pardon the pun, effective on the PS3, while on the 360 it seems overbearing and sort of botched. As far as gameplay goes, I didn't really notice any differences between the two other than what seemed like a slightly better frame rate, but honestly that's kind of hard to tell. I did find that I was shooting a little more accurately in this version of the game, but I'd probably chalk that up to me being more familiar and comfortable with Sony controllers. If you're gonna play Dead Space and you absolutely cannot get your hands on a PC to play it on, either console version will do just as well. If you're used to playing games on console, it's pretty likely you'll be used to 30 FPS and some slowdowns, so any real downsides may totally go unnoticed. However, there is another port to talk about, one that's a little outside of my typical expertise. A little more than 2 years after Dead Space hit PCs and consoles, EA decided Android and iPhone users needed to be able to delimb Necromorphs too. Sadly, this game is no longer available on either the App Store or Google Play, but after going through something like 5 of the most popular Android emulators, I found one that would play it. Sort of. For some reason or another, I could only get one of these several Dead Space APKs I downloaded to work, but that one dumps me back to the home screen just when things start to heat up. So this won't be what you might call a review, but from what I can tell, this was, I don't know, okay enough. Since I'm forced to control this thing with a mouse, it's damn near unplayable since it needs multiple inputs at once, but as you might imagine, actual touchscreen controls would definitely make up for this. Sadly, I'm in a position where the only way I can play this game is with the least efficient control scheme imaginable, so I can't exactly pass judgment on it in that way, and the emulator showed poor performance, so I can't really critique how well the game ran either. So let's just leave it at this. Dead Space was at one point a mobile game and no longer is, and that's about all I'm willing to say with any confidence on the matter. Heading back to a version of the game I can actually run, I just couldn't finish this video off without touching on one of its most impressive features. I think the guys at Visceral really understood that visuals and tight design may be all well and good, but above all else, sound is the main thread that ties the experience together, and holy hell did they prove it. Just standing still in a relatively safe area will have you being bombarded with atmospheric noises and tension-building string ensembles. There are more traditional music tracks that are used in moments of heavy action, but mostly the soundtrack is made up of soft, drawn-out tones that are mixed very quietly into the background. Going back and taking a listen, the real emphasis seems to be on sounds you would probably assume would be heard on an ancient spacefaring vessel. Creaks, cracks, slams, and of course the sounds of necromorphs doing whatever it is necromorphs do. Sound effects like shooting and melee attacks have a surprisingly crunchy sort of audio feedback, and each of the game's enemies has a distinct noise that'll let you know what's in the room before actually seeing them. But that brings me to my favorite aspect of this game's audio design, its incredible surround sound implementation. Honestly, Dead Space may have some of the absolute best surround sound decoding I've ever heard in a video game before. In some games, surround sound elements might be limited to certain environments, cutscenes, or audio assets as to cut back on the overall size of the game, but Dead Space has every single element perfectly represented in 5.1, making this one of the few games where you'll have an honest-to-goodness 360 degrees of spatial awareness in. If something's going on over your left shoulder, you're definitely going to know about it, which plays double duty when there's a loud background sound effect and you instinctively turn Isaac around to see if there's a horde of necromorphs coming up behind you or something just fell off a shelf. If you have a home theater setup or some 5.1 headphones, I'd say there is absolutely no better benchmark for audio excellence than Dead Space. And I think that might be all of the technical info I can give about this game. If I haven't made it clear yet, let me just state out loud for the record that Dead Space is incredible. Not only is it fun to play, but the sheer amount of effort that went into its creation is honestly staggering. From my perspective, this is a case study in how well a small studio can do when given a budget and enough room to create something they truly love. Sadly, as most of you probably know, this would be a unique experience in the series as EA became more and more entangled in Visceral's work as the series would go on, but for now we can just sit back and marvel at such an incredible landmark in video games. These guys may not have reinvented the wheel or used any mind-blowing new technologies to create Dead Space, but they did put in an amount of effort very rarely seen in the AAA gaming space. It's kind of one of those storybook scenarios where hard work, diligence, and dedication really did win the day. The horror in the game was approached with real respect, meaning it's not all about deferring to jump scares, although there's definitely no shortage of those. Most of the memorable scares for me consisted of me exploring an area and hearing a rise in action in the music, totally expecting to get swarmed by enemies, but then just continuing on with nothing really happening. This kind of slow-building, miserable atmosphere is exactly what I loved about the Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, so to say I was a little comfortable here would be one hell of an understatement. The gameplay, while technically just being another over-the-shoulder third-person shooter, makes sure you don't come into this one as an expert and really expects a lot out of you. Alright, look, I'm kind of rambling. The point I'm trying to make is that Dead Space is a marvel of creative game design. It uses a lot of tired tropes, but somehow molds them into a truly unique gaming experience. If by some act of God you haven't played Dead Space yet, please remedy that issue immediately. It really is something special, and having played through this first entry, I am absolutely stoked to jump into more of the series. But until I do, I want to thank all of you for making it this far, and here's hoping I see all of you again right here on the Dead Space Retrospective. Hey people, thanks for sitting through another long one. If you love the Dead Space series, I'll have some more content linked here on screen, and if you want to help these full series retrospectives continue, maybe stop by my Patreon page and contribute to the cause, as it were. And I guess if I could ask for one more small thing, maybe just have a really killer day today. Or you know what, that's a fucking order, just do it. Alright, see you guys later.